All right, so we've talked a lot about the two quarterbacks in this game and how refreshing it was that they played good football. And it's refreshing because in this season, including a lot of times the incumbent Heisman Trophy carrier, we've not seen good quarterback play across the country. And we're talking from top level programs. We're not seeing really good quarterback play. I've got a couple of theories that I'm going to get into a little bit later. And one of them you've kind of already touched on a little bit, but I want you to kind of kick it off in giving us maybe some context on why we should expect that there's not great quarterback play this year.
So I've tried to dig into this a little bit because I think it's always sort of fascinating to look back and try to figure out why things happen in the sport of college football. And the thing that I've always argued, college football is really not determined on things that happen this year. It's usually more like a 3-year span. Why did Auburn just get blown out by LSU? It's not Hugh Freeze. It's Brian Harsin that did that. The recruiting classes for the couple years prior to Hugh Freeze were terrible. Their roster is not at an upper half of the SEC level, and they got exposed against LSU. And it's easy to point to the current coaches, and everybody looks at the current quarterback, and they say, oh, if we just started this guy instead of this guy, we'd be great. The truth is that's wishful thinking, right? That's thinking I have a solution right now, and if I just pick that, well, then I'll get the 11-win season that I hope for. Fans never want to accept reality to say, we don't have an 11-win quarterback on the roster. We don't have an 11-win team worth of talent on the roster. There's no scheme solution that's going to fix our problems as a football team offensively. Now, defensively, interestingly, I think if you are bad on defense, it almost always can be fixed with coaching because you see a lot of Duke is not a splendiferously talented defense. But they're pretty darn good because if you're doing everything you're supposed to do right on every play in college where you don't get many reps, you can be a good defense. But I really wanted to focus on the quarterbacks in particular. And the thing that I suggested to Daniel was this feels like another one of those eras where there just have been a couple bad classes from recruiting classes for quarterbacks. And what I mean by that is we got a little spoiled from somewhere around 2015 through 2020, maybe even 2022, where there were just a lot of quarterbacks in a handful of cycles that were really high level. And you'd have like 4 or 5 in a given class that were great all at once. And that happened over and over again. And it meant, scoring, especially at elite level at college football, was really high. That sort of ignores that doesn't always happen. And there was an era there around 2009 through 2014, where there were a lot of bad periods for quarterback play. Brantley was a guy that took over for Tim Tebow at Florida, and he was pretty well regarded, but not that highly regarded. Ended up being a bust. Texas, when Mack Brown ended his era at Texas, I have always argued the problem for Texas, they needed a quarterback to replace Colt McCoy. And if you look at the quarterbacks who were available, really there's a period there where nobody really got a good quarterback for about 2 or 3 years. All the kids out of high school from a couple years busted, and everybody that had QB turnover in that period. That was a period where Alabama had to go get Jake Coker as a transfer. They all had holes at quarterback, and either you got a transfer or you were kind of stuck. And my suggestion right now is we're kind of in the same world. If you look at 2022, for example, your top 5 quarterbacks were Drew Aller at Penn State, who I think has been good and is well thought of, but we'll talk about in the preview, statistically not doing that great. Cade Klubnik was the number 2 quarterback and has been, I think, a flop. Connor Wegman was the number 3, has not been particularly good for A&M, looked better, and then got hurt for the year. Ty Simpson was the number 5 guy and has looked pretty bad at Alabama, just looks completely unprepared. Then Devin Brown, Walker Howard, who's not played, Gunnar Stockton, who's never played, Nick Evers, who's never really played at a high level, Malik Murphy. They're all stacked up at a few schools and either haven't been good enough to start or are backing up other good players. But in general, college football hasn't really drawn from them. You look at the year prior, it's really the 2021 class that's defined everything. That was the class with Ewers, Caleb Williams, Sam Howard at Washington, Drake May, Vandergriff, J.J. McCartney. Kyle McCord's also in that class. That group has really buttressed everybody that's good at the quarterback position. But like 2020, we look at Bryce Young, we look at C.J. Stroud, the 2 guys that went pro early, and they were phenomenal. Who are the other guys? Well, DJU was the other 5-star. Evan Prater at Cincinnati was the next one. Jackson at Texas, nobody remembers him. Hudson Card at Texas. Malik Hornsby was really bad at Arkansas. Harrison Bailey at Tennessee transferred. Luke Doty at South Carolina. Haynes King at Texas A&M. That is a weak class. It had 2 studs, and then the entire top 10 was full of busts. And again, 2023, those guys are still new, but Arch Manning, Lama Leva, maybe. But you go down the rest of the group, there's not really. Dante Moore is the one guy really contributing. So if you go back class after class after class, there's really only one class in 2021 that hit, and they hit hard. And if you've got a QB in that 2021 class, then you're in pretty good shape. And outside that, there are a couple others like Carson Beck, who's a 2020 guy, and I think finally just sat behind Bennett until he was good enough. Everybody relying on those 2020 and 2022 classes, which is the situation that Alabama's in, and the situation a lot of other schools are in, they're really struggling. And I think really when you go back and look at it, it's easy to say that they maybe picked the wrong guy, but the truth of the matter is I think those classes just didn't produce that many good quarterbacks. And so if you caught the cycles at the wrong time, and again, like you look at Alabama, they had a 2020 QB. You look at Ohio State, they had a 2020 QB. Well, the next guy they needed to get was in 2022 or 2023, and none of those guys that were really viable for them were also somebody that was able to start at a high level the way that Bryce Young or C.J. Stroud was. So it's interesting how that plays out in cycles, and I think sometimes people take it for granted. Real life isn't NCAA football 2024. You don't always have 5 computer-generated players that can plug in a given rating like the guys before. Sometimes you have players at a position, and sometimes you don't have players that are as good at a position as Young and Stroud were in that 2020 class. And I think that's really been the driving force right now for a lot of offensive woes around the country.
Yeah, and we talked about Penix and Bo Nix, who look mature, who look comfortable in their offenses. And we've got a bunch of guys that, you know, there for a while it was pretty in vogue to start true freshman quarterbacks because RPO was easily defeating defenses. Defenses were on roller skates for a few years. So you could have these young guys come out and look really good and put up numbers. But historically what you've seen is quarterbacks, even in the RPO era, quarterbacks need to sit for a couple of years. They sit behind a guy, they learn the system, and then they get their time to shine. And even their first year after sitting for a couple of years is often kind of shaky. We're seeing that with Kyle McCord, who I think is a solid quarterback, but he's had time to kind of marinate, and he's not all world. What I think you're seeing in some of these classes are guys who hit college football coming out of where almost everybody runs RPO in college, right? And it was so hot, in high school. In high school, that's where RPO originated, and then it caught on in college for a few years as being what everybody was running as a competitive advantage. And so these guys were ready-made in these offensive systems to run RPO like they've been running for 4 years, 6 years, or whatever. Well, you got a handful of seasons of guys that have hit college where defenses have figured out RPO a little bit. So when they get their time, they're kind of behind the 8 ball when they come into a college system that is no longer purely RPO. So I think that at that point, a lot of their development in college, a lot of their numbers, and a lot of their Elite 11 stuff where they do scale drills and 7-on-7, that stuff is not indicative of what they're going to see in college, and it's almost stunting their growth at this point. And I feel like colleges are having to unlearn a little bit of bad habits maybe that they're learning in high school systems that are still very RPO heavy.
Yeah, and to that point, I mentioned that there was kind of this lull period around 2010 through 2014-15 in quarterbacks. And it really was the same transition because we moved out of there was this period around 2010 where high schools had been running this really heavy spread offense stuff, right? And the zone read had come into its own. Hurry up, no huddle had come into its own at the college level. And that was the period where 2010 and Cam Newton was really at the pinnacle, right? Nobody quite knew how to stop it. Through 2013, Auburn was the one, probably the most notable, making 2 championship games running that offense. And then they kind of figured it out. And around the country in that period, people were slowly figuring it out. And you had a lot of the top quarterbacks that came out of high school systems running those schemes. And they hit around 2013, 2014, 2015, where teams were figuring it out more, and the style of spread shifted to more of an RPO scheme. And suddenly it wasn't important that you were a great dual threat athlete so much as it was that you were a hyper accurate passer. And being athletic was an advantage, but the accurate passers with big arms were the guys that suddenly were dominant. And it really flipped a lot of things on its head. And it took years for that to kind of turn around from a positional perspective. But I'll say, to your point now, you look at a lot of the other quarterbacks that have been effective the past couple of years, and a lot of them are 2019 guys, right? Spencer Rattler was in 2019. Jaden Daniels was the number 2 quarterback 2019. Bo Nix was the number 3 quarterback in 2019. Talia Tagovailoa, number 8 in 2019. So I think the upshot now is we've gone back to this pro-style world where pre-snap reads are important, post-snap reads are important, understanding how to effectively read live, a high-low read, deliver the ball consistently, be a more heady, developed quarterback, understanding the offense, be more of a game manager. It matters again. And the guys that have been around now, and I mean, these 2019 guys, right, they're in their 5th year of college football. A lot of them have started multiple years, have a really distinct advantage. And like you said, it's important, I think, for these guys often to sit in the same system for like three years minimum before they're really good. A lot of times on the bench. Carson Beck, I think, has been playing at a really high level, but he sat there for years to get to the point, right? It's this, I think, 4th year in school. And it took that for him to be good. So the other thing I will say in evidence of this, to sort of wrap that around, is if you look at the transfers that transferred younger, a lot of them have been bad, right? Devin Leary, transferred over to Kentucky to run a more pro-style scheme, arguably than he ran in NC State, hasn't been good. Mertz ran over, wasn't very good. Peyton Thorne transferred, hasn't been very good. So you had the really, really old guys that were developed, moved to a school, had a couple years, the ones we're talking about, Daniels, Nix, Penix, none of them were all-stars out of the gate at those schools. It took them a few years to learn the new system. And now we're seeing the guys, even the older guys that transfer or in multiple schemes, they're not good in the new scheme immediately. It's becoming really, really obvious, in my opinion, that the way to be successful is you have to be at one place for multiple years and then take over that scheme. If you try to hop around or you try to start early, we're back in the old school world where it's just extremely hard to be successful if you don't have a really, really good grasp of an offense.
Yeah, I think it's, what we saw from Georgia for 2 years, what we're seeing now is quarterback OC scheme fit is more important than having an ultra skilled quarterback in college football. Bryce Young never, he was ultra skilled, number 1 overall pick. That Alabama offense under Bryce Young never felt dominant. It never dictated the game like even the older Alabama offenses that didn't have great quarterbacks did. Meanwhile, you've got Stetson Bennett in Georgia getting drafted much later because his skills at the next level weren't as desirable. But in college, OCQB scheme fit and tenure understanding in that program is lethal. And I think we're seeing that, it's also not just quarterbacks, Josh, but it's like when you have a cycle of quarterbacks going early and high, like CJ Stroud, Bryce Young, guys that still had eligibility left, that leaves a void. And then when you have a slew of offensive coordinators leave the game, either to go to the NFL or be head coaches somewhere, that doubly slows down the progress of offenses in college football. Pair that with defenses figuring things out. We haven't even talked about this on the flip side, and I'll give you kind of the closing shot on this because we are running a little long. This is all happening, the RPO stuff and the bad classes, at the same time that defenses are getting much better again because everything's cyclical. So it's like everything is working against having a dominant quarterback and a dominant passing offense right now in college football.
Yeah, and we're seeing that. We're seeing that on a couple levels, and I'll say it 2 different ways. One, this is a weird thing to say, but would you agree with me? Florida would have been better off with a 4th round pick level quarterback that stayed at Florida for 4 or 5 years
Yes, 100%.
than a first round talent in Richardson that didn't understand mentally where he needed to be at the time that he left. And he just wasn't developed well enough out of high school. That's why he didn't start immediately. We talked about it when he was a freshman. There was plenty of stuff on tape that you could tell that he didn't know how to really run an offense. That's why Mullen didn't play him. And I think he has every potential to be a great quarterback one day, but I think he's a few years off. And so he left without really being where he needed to be in college, and now he left a void, like you're saying, for them. And the other side is that you get guys that maybe have a tremendous amount of skill but don't know how to run the scheme well, and they're being really unproductive even on good teams. And the example to me with that is Alabama. Jalen Milroe has a big arm. He throws the deep ball pretty well, and it is pretty well. He's sometimes a little inaccurate, but his receivers have generally made up for it. But the problem is he does not understand that scheme very well. It's really obvious on tape. Watching that Arkansas game in the second half where it got close, there's so much stuff that they should be doing that should be making things easier for them that he doesn't know how to do. And what was funny to me or weird to me is that Alabama was running the ball really well in the second half at times. It's not the offensive line. And you see, like I saw on Twitter, Alabama fans are all griping about their offensive line. Their offensive line is pretty darn good. Like their tackles got beat a couple times in that game. I mean, Arkansas's, they've got the number 4 edge rusher in the conference in Jackson. It's not surprising they got a couple pressures. It's the same reason they held LSU in check. But the offensive line got a ton of push on run plays for the most part. They gave him a lot of time on those deep balls. The problem is that Jalen Milroe does not know how to read deep and short. And when he throws short, he throws with really bad mechanics, and he's inconsistent. He doesn't hit his windows most of the time. He's often very late on his windows. He doesn't know how to call protection, which is why they're now calling it in from the sideline. He's like 2 years away from where he needs to be developmentally from a scheme perspective to run that offense. And I think if this was the true RPO era, where they had a guy that is a top shelf athlete as a runner and a big arm that could fit the ball in a tight space because he is a cannon, they'd probably be doing great running just pure RPO. That's what they'd be doing. They'd be hitting people over the top, or they'd be running the ball underneath, and they'd just making you commit, and it's a simple read for him. Defenses know how to take that away now. They know how to crash. They've developed different positions with their safeties. They can take away those routes. And so now all of a sudden they got a quarterback that needs to know at the snap, hey, I got a corner blitz here. I need to either slot shift my protection, or I need to call this guy hot and throw it off the top. And it's about a 30% chance that he sees it. And most of the time he's getting clocked. I know I saw a couple statistics that were telling, one of which is that Jalen Milroe at Alabama has by far the longest time to throw. It takes almost 3.5 seconds, about 3.4 seconds to throw the ball. And if you look at the top guys like Jackson Dart, they're throwing it a little over 2 seconds. He's about 50% slower than the best quarterbacks in the SEC, and that causes sacks. The fact that you have to throw deep because he can't reliably throw intermediate and short causes sacks. And that's all about mechanics as a passer. It's all about understanding scheme. It's all about understanding, as we've said before, he progresses decently well. He'll look at one guy, the second, and the third, but he doesn't read well, meaning he doesn't know, where do I start my progression? What's the guy based on this blitz, based on the scheme, based on this coverage? Where should my eyes start? Who's going to be the first guy open? He doesn't understand those concepts, and it causes him to need to go through a progression. So all that really builds into a quarterback and an offense that's really ineffective. And everybody looks at the overall offensive performance. They look at the scheme. They blame the offensive line. And the truth of the matter, like you said, Daniel, is it's about quarterback comfortability in a scheme. So it's all about quarterback fit to an offensive coordinator. And I'll say, by the way, I don't think Reese built this offense for Milroe and where he is. So you can put a lot of blame on Alabama never finding an identity that probably should have been found in the spring until it was week 4 of the season. And so now they're just trying to jerry-rig everything. But that stuff is just so much more important than I think it has been in maybe 10 plus years of college football.
Yeah, and if you think, if you want to see another example of this, just look at Tennessee. Like, Josh Heupel didn't go from one of the best offenses in the country and forget how to call an offense in the next year. It's just he doesn't have a quarterback who is comfortable in his scheme, and he had one last year. And by the way, Hendon Hooker had a lot of years of experience before really blowing up. So, all right, y'all, that's it for us on the recap and kind of talking college football quarterbacks in this season. Let us know in the comments what you think is the biggest reason why college football play this year has seen poor quarterback play. All right, thanks so much, y'all. Have a great week. God bless.